Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching What Did Ancient Indian Cities Actually Look Like by Odd Compass. Now we haven't reacted to one of Odd Compass's videos before, but I saw this one pop into my recommended, and I thought the premise sounded absolutely fascinating. It's a question that I don't know the answer to. I don't know what ancient Indian cities looked like, so I'm really excited to learn. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Indian history has a big problem.
Oh?
Its cities are faceless, shapeless. If I talk about ancient Rome, your imagination will construct marble columns and cobblestone facades, wine bars and togas. In a sense, you can see it. Good for Rome, but what about India?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about that. Now, I don't like to talk for other people but myself. I will say I don't know that much about Indian history, so I definitely don't know what ancient Indian cities looked like. I will say generally, I suppose in the English-speaking world, or maybe in the United States specifically, right, that's where I live, there definitely is some broad cultural idea of ancient Rome. You see it a lot in media, in popular history. There is no, I don't think, sort of popular vision of ancient Indian history or ancient Indian cities. Now, I will say, having that popular idea, it does make it more present in the minds of a lot of people. It does come with issues too, like some of those common ideas about how Rome was are misconceptions or oversimplifications, right? So it's not entirely accurate. But I think the point that Odd Compass is starting with, there's some truth to it.
What did ancient Indian cities actually look like, and how did people live? Thus far, popular media has done a poor job showing it. Well, that's about to change right now.
All right.
Today, we're going to reconstruct a hypothetical ancient Indian city from scratch, using both archaeological evidence and the written record as a guide.
Interesting. First of all, I love the editing style. So we're not going to be talking about a specific ancient Indian city. They're going to be gathering the evidence that we do have and then creating a hypothetical city that basically relies on the common elements that those cities would have had at the time. That's an interesting method.
But first, let's address the elephant in the room. Where have all the ruins gone? Not just temples and forts, but structures that define the everyday lives of normal citizens. Houses, taverns, docks, libraries, hospitals, markets. These are the structures that could help us envision India's bustling ancient cities. So why has most of it just disappeared? Though the most dramatic explanations center on invasions, fire and plunder and other atrocities, they don't tell the full story. The lack of ruins can actually be blamed on two main culprits: perishable materials and repurposed materials. Throughout Indian history, wood, mud brick, and stucco were used to build everything from arenas to houses and markets, many of which were beautifully carved, tiled, and painted. But these materials are vulnerable to the elements.
Right. You see this in a lot of places around the world. Certain old buildings, ruins remain due to what they're made out of, and many don't, right? So depending on what material was used, your ancient ruins may or may not survive, right? This is a loss of time as these structures deteriorate over the centuries.
If not properly maintained, they will rot and decay and collapse. And in the event of a fire, they will burn. These structures almost never survive for more than a few centuries, leaving us with nothing but a few stone ruins surrounded by empty plots of land. That being said, even stone buildings were destroyed so that the materials could be reused elsewhere. After a period of political upheaval, entire cities might be torn down, the stone repurposed for new buildings, ruins cleared to make room for pastures, and unused infrastructure turned into quarries. Temples and other religious structures were the few to avoid this removal-reuse paradigm. But this gives us an incomplete picture. Because most of what we see today are ancient temples and monasteries, we tend to paint Indians as a one-dimensional spiritual people. Got all that context? It's time to build an ancient...
And that's sort of one of the points I was making with something like our vision of ancient Rome, right? We sort of judge based on what survives, and that can give us misconceptions, right? He's talking about the one here where a bunch of ancient temples survive. we go, wow, they must have been an extremely religious people. It must have been the number one thing to them. Perhaps, or perhaps not. Right? A lot of things with ancient Roman history, we have all these marble statues remaining, these stark white marble statues in ruins, and that gives people the misconception that ancient Rome was this stark white marble city, when that's not true. First of all, for a lot of its history, ancient Rome was predominantly not marble, but even when it was often painted, decorated, colorful. So we judge based on what we have, but we have to make sure not to draw misconceptions out of the evidence we have access to. So I like the sort of approach they're describing here. This is a very interesting topic that I haven't thought about before.
An Indian city from the ground up. With help from our team of architectural historians, we've put together a blueprint for the sort of Indian megacity that would have existed between 500 BCE and 500 CE,
Okay.
an era of intense urbanization. Let's name our city Compaspur.
It's a pretty wide period, talking about 1,000 years of history. But once again, when people talk about, say, ancient Rome, they're also being extremely broad with the time frame.
But here's what we need to build for our ancient Indian population. We're gonna have to build all of that. Let's jump right in. First things first, we need toilet facilities, because when you gotta go, you gotta go. Based on the archaeological evidence, we know that ancient Indian toilets were rather sophisticated in their design and construction. Toilets were built into shallow pits lined with terracotta, brick, or stone, and the waste was disposed of through channels connected to the citywide sewage and drainage system. In fact, the sewage and drainage systems in ancient Indian cities were among the most advanced of their time.
Yeah, and you see, really whenever you have a very developed urban area with a lot of people, eventually some type of sewage has to develop. Now, it may be more advanced or less advanced, but you see this in ancient Rome as well. And this is also something that, remember, this may be contained to urban centers. This is another one of those misconceptions people sometimes have. I'm using ancient Rome a lot, but that's a frame of reference I am more familiar with, where people look at the city of Rome at various points, and they say, wow, the advanced systems of water and sewage, the empire was so advanced. It's like, well, some urban centers were, but this was not common for most people, right? As most people lived in the countryside. But we are talking about an era when it seems like in Indian history, there were a lot of people living in these urban centers. So once again, try not to overgeneralize what we know into an entire region when it may not be applicable. But yeah, sort of sanitation, sewage, that makes sense when you're talking about a big, developed urban center.
Primary sewage and drainage lines were made from brick and stone and ran along the main streets. These were connected to the smaller lines that carried waste away from individual houses.
Wow.
Sewage and drainage lines were sloped to facilitate the flow of waste and were covered by stone slabs to minimize bad odors. That's right, no open sewers. In larger cities, sewage and drainage systems were connected to rivers.
That's pretty nice. There are a lot of cities around the world that either didn't figure that out or frankly forgot how to do it until relatively recently.
Or other water bodies where waste would be washed away and diluted. Since pollution and contamination were to be avoided, city officials implemented restrictions on excessive waste disposal. But home toilets were just one solution. Public toilets were placed strategically throughout the city, particularly in
Right, you see a lot of public toilets in ancient Roman culture, for example.
market areas and near public buildings. Bathing was also an essential part of daily life. Private homes often included rooms equipped with square bathing platforms made of stone or terracotta. These platforms were slightly raised, with a gentle slope leading towards a drain, which was connected to the citywide sewage and drainage system. Public baths were an important feature of ancient Indian cities too. These elaborate bathing complexes were made from bricks or stone slabs that were plastered over to prevent water seepage. Some of these bathing complexes had different sections for men and women, and different sections for hot and cold water, among other conveniences. These public baths were often built in gymnasiums or near social gathering spots, such as parks and stepwells, and were maintained by city authorities or even local merchant guilds.
Seems like public baths were sort of a big part of daily life, of culture for a lot of different places, some places even to this day. Once again, ancient Rome, public bathing, that was a big public ritual, a big social space, frankly. People would socialize, a big part of daily life. Seems like the same thing here. You can think of a country like Japan. That has a lot of public bathing in its history as a big part of social life, and that's still even a part of the culture to this day. So it's an interesting commonality you see in a lot of different cultures around the world. Of course, part of culture, part of society. Also, even if you don't know it, good for sanitation. Gets everybody cleaned up nicely.
That's hogwash, you say. Garbage. No, this is garbage, and cities have a lot of it. So
Right.
How did ancient Indians dispose of all their garbage? Indian cities developed detailed guidelines for maintaining cleanliness. Most importantly, they appointed officials who ensured that waste did not accumulate in living areas and public spaces. Garbage was collected.
I think this is something that New York City could figure out. No offense to the New Yorkers out there, but, they're still working out their public trash situation.
In designated areas throughout the city and was then transported to the outskirts. There, it would be composted and turned into fertilizer, burned, or buried. For example, excavations have revealed the existence of large brick-lined pits used as garbage dumps. Day-to-day cleanliness was maintained by public sanitation workers, tasked with sweeping streets and moving waste at regular intervals. Regular citizens, too, were expected to maintain cleanliness around their living and working areas. Failure to abide by these standards would result in fines. Let's get wet. Access to clean and abundant.
I do wonder, we're talking about 500 BC to 500 AD, about 1,000-year period. We're talking about all these different systems and employees they had, some private, but then a lot of public. So I am wondering, what sort of empire or government was ruling over this hypothetical city. Are we talking about several different governments that would employ sort of public employees for these types of jobs? That's something I don't necessarily know. Maybe someone can clear it up in the comments down below.
Abundant water is a priority in city building. So it was in India too. To supplement natural sources of water, wells were dug throughout ancient Indian cities. These wells were usually communal and were meant to serve multiple households. That being said, private wells were often built inside larger homes, and sophisticated pulley systems were used to draw water. Water storage, on the other hand, was accomplished through the use of large tanks, reservoirs, and step wells. These storage facilities collected and stored rainwater, ensuring a steady supply for the city, even during dry periods. Step wells are particularly noteworthy. Steps leading down to the water allowed for easy access even as water levels fluctuated. But step wells were not just for water storage and distribution. Elaborately decorated, step wells were designed to serve as multi-purpose community structures, as beautiful, shaded rest areas for the public to gather, relax, and play. These various water storage facilities were connected to an intricate network of terracotta pipelines, aqueducts, and canals to distribute water throughout the city. Public fountains and spouts were placed at key points throughout the city so that people could draw water as needed. These water access points were often decorated with carvings and were strategically located in marketplaces, near temples, and along major streets.
I mean, it seems like a pretty effective system, and think about it. When you're thinking about crafting a large urban center, I think waste disposal in multiple different ways and water are two of the most important things you're going to need to provide people. So it's important to get those two out of the way and handled. And seems like, you're talking about any good city. Frankly, at a lot of points throughout history, you have these public services provided. You also have these public spaces provided, right? These services are offered in public spaces, spaces for people to gather, do their buying and selling, hang out, clean themselves. And also these things are sort of decorated, right? It makes for a nice public space if you've got a private sector or a government that's willing to do it, but that does make for a relatively happy, satisfied populace generally.
As for the water itself, measures were taken to ensure its purity. Boiling water before drinking was common practice. Additionally, natural filters, such as cloth and sand, were used to remove impurities. Houses and neighborhoods. What were neighborhoods like in ancient India? Residential layouts were influenced by texts like the Manasara and the Vastu Shastra, which provided guidelines on architecture, town planning, and spatial arrangement. Megasthenes, a Greek diplomat who lived in the Mauryan capital of Pataliputra, described the city's neighborhoods as well-planned, with orderly rows of houses, broad streets, and distinct quarters for different social groups. So,
I do always love to see some crossover and get some Greek diplomats coming in. Remind you that, of course, at this moment right now, the world is more globalized than it's ever been before, but this is not a new phenomenon. Right? The world has been connected for a long time, even when you may not think it's so. There have been long-standing, pretty wide-spreading trade lines, diplomatic connections for a long time.
Suggesting a highly organized administrative structure. Neighborhood bonds were reinforced by public spaces, such as gymnasiums, baths, small temples, courtyards, gardens, and meeting halls. And these spaces were typically built at central intersections to improve accessibility.
I mean, that's exactly what I was talking about a little earlier, and I will say that, frankly, I think that's really important today, and at least often in the United States, we don't have a lot of these public spaces, but I will say it's even more important when you live in an era where, people can't necessarily connect very easily over long distances. And most people, probably aren't even going to leave the city that much. That makes the community within the city even more important. But once again, I still think things like this are very important today.
That's all very cool, but housing forms the core of a neighborhood. So what did these ancient Indian houses actually look like? Materials and designs varied considerably. In drier inland regions, houses were generally built with stone or brick and had flat roofs and plastered over walls. Meanwhile, in lush coastal regions, houses were built with wood, bamboo, and terracotta and had sloping roofs to facilitate rainwater drainage. Designs ranged from simple, single-room dwellings to more elaborate, multi-story structures. The most common type was the courtyard house, and it's a design that remains popular in India today. As per the design, the central courtyard ensured that there was light, ventilation, and a space for domestic activities.
I think this sort of design is a lot more common in the sort of pre-modern era than it is today, because we're living in an era where you really have to be conscious of the interplay between inside and outside spaces for a couple of reasons, but the main two are for light, right? Because you're really relying on natural light, and two, for ventilation, right? These are things you really have to be concerned about. And so, like I said, especially in the pre-modern era, you're going to really be thinking about position of windows and courtyards and entrances and exits in a way that, maybe architects, I'm sure architects think of that stuff today, but I don't think your average individual has as much of that in their mind when you've got, electricity and AC and, things like that. But this was very much a big part of the living world at that point.
Rooms were arranged around this central courtyard, with private rooms located towards the back of the house and reception areas located towards the entrance. In wealthier households, there would be multiple stories and multiple courtyards, and these would be adorned with plants, fountains, and sculptures. The interior walls were elaborately decorated with murals, carvings, and intricate woodwork detailing.
Fancy.
Side note, it's important to reiterate that ancient Indian cities were not flat. In fact, they were full of multi-story structures, houses included. Fortunately for the people of Compaspur, ancient Indian cities were thriving hubs of entertainment. Theaters were typically located near the city center or the royal palace, and adhered to principles outlined in texts like the Natya Shastra, which provided detailed guidance on stage dimensions, acoustics, and seating. Theaters had a raised...
And you see all these public spaces centered in the center of the city, sort of connects with what I was saying earlier about how important these public spaces are both today, but especially then, when you're so connected to your local community. When you live in an era when, you can't get very far, right, in a short period of time. You're probably going to be walking most places, maybe you've got like a donkey or a horse or something, but I imagine most people will be walking wherever they're going, and so you need everything that you're going to need in your daily life within pretty quick walking distance to your home. And even things that you're not going to use as often, you're going to want within a pretty close proximity. What that means is you have to really pay attention to city design and density, right? It needs to be a densely designed urban space with all the necessities relatively nearby. And even, like I said, those things that may not be necessities, but even some of the luxuries, they're going to have to be in close proximity for the vast majority of people.
Detailed guidance on stage dimensions, acoustics, and seating. Theaters had a raised stage with a backdrop for actors to change costumes, and seating was arranged in a semicircular or rectangular pattern around the stage, allowing the audience to have a clear view of the performance. Larger theaters could accommodate several thousand spectators at once. Looking to spend quality time with beautiful people? Indian cities were built with specialized red light districts for adult entertainment.
Hello.
These districts were situated near marketplaces or along busy thoroughfares and were marked by elaborate gateways. Red light districts were vibrant nightlife.
Red light district, one of, if not the most ancient businesses of humankind.
Hubs, and featured taverns, gambling houses, and other venues for adult entertainment. They also included well-constructed homes and salons where courtesans entertained their guests. Courtesan spaces were designed to provide an elegant and inviting environment. For example, salons featured spacious reception rooms, courtyards, and private chambers, and were adorned with luxurious furnishings, artworks, and musical instruments. Sports were an essential pillar of entertainment in ancient India. Fighting pits were among the most common arenas. They were essentially leveled grounds where wrestlers and boxers could compete, and this area was surrounded by...
Sports, once again, I'm really talking about sort of the design of cities and communities in this one, but seems pretty relevant. Of course, sports are a big part of community today, and that varies depending on where you go. They're a really big part of community in certain countries or cities, and that has been true throughout history, and sometimes it's been very true, right? I mean, you can think of, once again, ancient Rome, gladiators, or you can think of Constantinople with chariot racing, right? Those chariot races, not only did they bring people together, because once again, with all we're talking about, you've got a bunch of people in one urban space, they can't go that far. That means you have a lot of people coming together for these big sporting events, but in Constantinople, those chariot races, those were a big part of social life, a big part of culture, even a big part of politics, right? The two chariot teams, their supporters sort of formed into two different political factions. So sports throughout history have been a massive part of community, culture, sometimes politics, right? A lot of facets of life.
Raised platforms and terrace stands for spectators. Meanwhile, chariot races and horse races were held on purpose-built tracks, similar to the hippodromes of the Greco-Roman world.
Right, exactly.
The tracks were often encircled by low walls to keep spectators safe. Cities were also dotted with gymnasiums. Facilities included training equipment, bathing areas, and open courtyards for sporting activities. But gymnasiums were not just for physical training. They were social hubs where men gathered to discuss everything from philosophy to politics.
I will say, you're seeing a lot of similarities between this hypothetical ancient Indian city and a lot of ancient cities in Rome or Greece or, a lot of different places. Part of that might be some cultural similarities. I think part of it may just be that large groups of people get together. There tend to be certain things they want to do, and those tend to be the same things, or at least similar things. Now, of course, you'll have cultural differences and different types of activities and lifestyles depending on where you go. I'm not denying that. But I think you look at these large gatherings of people in urban centers in particular, and you do see a lot of similarities in a lot of different places.
Great cities are designed with public spaces in mind. Ancient India was no exception. Town squares were central to the social and commercial life of ancient Indian cities. They were located at the crossroads of major streets and served as focal points for public gatherings and activities. Smart design enhanced these aspects. Town squares were open and spacious, paved with stone, and were adorned with pillars, statues, and gateways for both decorative and symbolic purposes. And trees were planted to provide shade. Importantly, town squares were multifunctional spaces. Certain sections might be reserved for public meetings and performances, while other sections were designated as pop-up marketplaces with a variety of stalls. The bustling atmosphere of these spaces made them popular social hubs. People from different walks of life would gather to trade, gossip, and discuss the news of the day. Public parks and gardens were common features in ancient Indian cities, providing an additional space for relaxation, exercise, and socializing.
Hey, green space is important, man, especially when you're in a city. And people often underestimate the importance of trees in particular. I mean, trees do a lot of things. I mean, trees are good for air quality. I mean, that's something we know now, but something they would have known then is trees are great for shade. And especially if you live in a hot city, trees can be very important to regulating temperature, right? This is something they have to deal with even today in a city like, say, Phoenix in Arizona. That city gets extremely hot. It's essentially in a desert. It's not exactly fit for human habitation. The water shortages and the heat, whatever. But one of the important things there is if you look at streets with trees on them versus streets without trees, the streets without trees are significantly hotter because there's no trees to provide shade. So trees are actually a pretty important part of any city for, like I said, a variety of reasons, visual reasons, having that green space, air quality. But if you're talking about places that get very hot, for shade in particular, and heat regulation.
They were also venues for community events, such as fairs and festivals. These spaces were meticulously maintained and incorporated a variety of elements: benches, pavilions, elaborately carved fountains, manicured lawns, groves of trees, flowering plants, shaded walkways, ponds, and lakes. Foreign visitors to India were extremely impressed. In his writings, the Chinese monk Xuanzang gushed about how scholars would go for strolls and engage in discussions amidst the well-maintained greenery. Markets and commerce. Urban markets were central to the economic life of ancient Indian cities. Markets were housed in large, open-air courtyards surrounded by a dense thicket of shops and stalls, made of wood primarily, and the ground was paved to accommodate heavy foot traffic. Interestingly, markets were often walled and gated, with guards stationed at the exits to provide security and collect tolls. Different areas were designated for different goods. The atmosphere of these ancient markets was lively, haggling was common, and the air filled with the sound of merchants calling out to customers and the clatter of goods being exchanged.
I'm sure you could get goods from a wide variety of places, right? Places that ranged wide and far. You know, you're talking about India of this period, a very cosmopolitan place. You've got trade coming both from the east and the west, so you'll have access to a lot of trade routes, a lot of goods from places, you know, pretty far away.
And in the event of a dispute, the parties involved could use one of the special courts established within or near marketplaces. Beyond markets, ancient Indian cities had specialized commercial districts for certain trades and industries. For example,
I would say something like that to specialized course, it does make me wonder more specifically about the state and governance, but I sort of asked that question earlier, and also I do recognize they're talking about a sort of hypothetical Indian city from the era, so they're sort of generalizing probably a lot of different states and governments and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, it does make me think about the specifics. That's one of the things about this style, that you can't necessarily get into a lot of those specifics. But I do like the style they've gone for, you know, because sometimes, you know, generalizing makes sense if you want to answer such a big question, like what did ancient Indian cities actually look like? Well, they've decided to generalize, take a lot of different examples, and put them into one. So you might miss some of the specific historical context and details, but they're providing sort of a large, broad message here.
example, there would be zones for pottery, metalwork, and textile production. These specialized districts featured rows and rows of workshops and warehouses where artisans produced and stored their goods, respectively. And the presence of decorative motifs on doorways and windows suggests that, even in these industrial areas, aesthetics were not entirely neglected. Commercial districts were often managed by guilds, which also played a significant role in regulating trade and maintaining quality standards. The physical presence of guild halls underscores their importance. The earliest references to healthcare facilities come from Buddhist sources, which mention the establishment of hospitals funded by rulers and wealthy patrons. Hospitals were designed with multiple wards, each catering to different types of ailments. For example, we know that there were separate wards for surgical cases, infectious diseases, and general care. These buildings typically included open courtyards, shaded verandas, and well-ventilated rooms. Notably, hospitals in ancient India served as training centers for medical students so that they could gain hands-on experience under the supervision of older physicians. But there were also smaller healthcare centers for minor ailments. Clinics and herbal dispensaries offered outpatient care. These clinics were run by practitioners who were trained in different branches of Ayurvedic medicine. More specialized medical facilities existed too. For example,
Yeah, you know, there's sort of healthcare of a lot of the ancient world in some places you'll find these bigger hospitals and institutions. Oftentimes healthcare is done in, less of a unified way. You got a lot of different clinics and healthcare providers using a lot of different methods. Oftentimes also in sort of pre-modern cultures around the world, healthcare is combined with sort of spiritualism and religious care, taking care of one's body and one's soul, mind. Their spirituality was often, seen as one and the same thing, right? So you can talk about, very different styles of healthcare in a lot of different places, but you do see some commonalities.
For example, surgical centers were established in larger cities. The famous ancient Indian physician Sushruta, often called the father of surgery, described the procedures performed at these centers, which included cataract surgery, granoplasty, and orthopedic surgery.
Oh, wow.
Worth noting, free medical care was extended to all citizens.
Nice.
Interestingly, Megasthenes found it odd that Indians had access to medical care regardless of their wealth or status, which was unlike anything he had seen in his Greek homeland.
Well, in some countries, namely the United States, you still don't have free access to medical care. There's been a bit of controversy surrounding that lately, and I'll leave it at that.
By the late Vedic period, large-scale educational institutions began to emerge in India's urban centers, sometimes attached to religious complexes, sometimes not. Based off student registration records, we know that universities like Takshila and Nalanda attracted students from across India, Central Asia, China, and Southeast Asia.
Wow.
Universities were not organized in a single building, but were instead a collection of colleges and schools spread across the city, each specialized in certain fields of study, such as medicine, law.
That's how a lot of universities still function today.
Mathematics, military science, and the arts. University structures included large lecture halls, libraries, and even residential quarters for students and teachers. In addition to formal educational institutions, ancient Indian cities had public libraries and informal centers of learning.
Nice.
These libraries were often attached to temples, palaces, or other significant buildings, and were accessible to both scholars and the general public. Public libraries were housed in large, well-ventilated buildings, with environments carefully designed to preserve the collection of palm leaf and bark manuscripts. The interior structure included reading rooms, as well as open spaces for group discussions and lectures. Government buildings. In ancient India, palaces were more than just royal hangouts. They were hubs of government, abuzz with state business. Indian palaces were architectural marvels. In Pataliputra, for example, the main palace was made of polished wood and was decorated with carvings and inlays of gold and precious stones.
Wow.
Grand entrances, large courtyards, and impressive gateways reinforced royal authority.
Yeah.
Palace complexes were
once again, you're talking about a world where, authority figures always want to project their authority. That's frankly an important part of having authority, is reminding people you have it. And when you're in a world like this, where, people may not interact with the government or feel like they interact with the government that much, sort of a very viable way of reminding them of that government presence is to have this grand royal/government palace that people may walk through on the regular, right? Have it be very grand, elaborate, expensive, decorated. That's a good reminder of royal authority. It's a very visual and literal depiction of that authority, right? So you see this for a lot of different types of authority, and of course you very much still see this today.
expansive, comprising several buildings, among them the king's private quarters and administrative offices, the treasury, and the assembly hall, which was a venue for council meetings and other official gatherings. Most importantly, the palace complex housed royal courts, with judges presiding over both civil and criminal disputes. But palace complexes were not the only source of governance. Administrative offices dotted the landscape of Indian cities. There, the day-to-day operations of the state were managed, from tax collection to trade regulation. Archaeological evidence suggests that these office buildings were built with brick and stone and features storage areas for sensitive documents, as well as spacious halls for conducting official business. Between 500 BCE and 500 CE, cities across the subcontinent saw the construction of numerous temples, stupas, monasteries, and other religious structures for its various faiths. These were not just places of worship, they were vibrant centers of community life and education. Each religious complex involved its own unique layout, with decorative towers, shrines, ritual halls, courtyards, and walking paths. That being said, certain aspects of the design had shared elements. For example, these structures usually had intricate carvings depicting mythological events relevant to the faith. The construction of a religious complex was a major civic project, often supported by kings and merchants, and there were significant economic benefits in doing so. These religious complexes became landholders, attracted trade, employed thousands, and earned revenue through donations.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is an era where you've got a variety of different methods of patronage. You know, today when we think a lot of the types of services talked about in this video, you'll think about a state, a government. But this is an era when you can get patronage, sure, from the government, the royal family, the nobility, a rich merchant, religious institution of some kind, right? There's a lot of different styles of patronage. And so a lot of these public services, they may be offered by the government, but they may be offered from other sources as well. And you see here churches, or I shouldn't say churches, temples in this case, religious institutions are an important source of patronage for a lot of things. And this was true around the world as well. You know, a lot of temples or churches or religious institutions, more than just being places for prayer or study, they were that. They were also community hubs. They could often be centers of business, you know, collecting donations, allowing people to meet over long distances, sometimes even, you know, having certain businesses they ran, owning large amounts of land, perhaps farming that land, right? This is a common theme. You can think of the Catholic Church in Europe, which for a long span of time held a lot of power, political power, economic power, you know, power over land. You know, they had a lot of influence beyond just their religious influence, and this has been true for religious institutions around the world, and what we're seeing here is no exception.
Tired of eating at home? You're in luck. Compaspor has a thriving F&B scene. Based on the historical record, we know that major cities had taverns and restaurants serving a variety of foods and alcoholic drinks, from local specialties to imported delicacies from around India and the world. Archaeologists have discovered communal dining areas and kitchen spaces, indicating the presence of large cafeteria-style eateries for the public. Most often, layouts included an open front design, low tables, cushions, and group seating arrangements. These venues not only served food, but also acted as social hubs for people of the city. Food and beverage establishments were typically located near marketplaces, in entertainment districts, and along other busy thoroughfares. And if you're coming into the city as a visitor, in major Indian cities, there were rest houses situated near the main gates, meant to provide shelter for merchants, pilgrims, and other visitors.
I think one thing you're seeing here, and by the way, this is a more general point, is that for a lot of ancient cities, there were a lot of public meeting spaces. And essentially any space where large numbers of people would gather would also become some sort of community space. This may seem a little unfamiliar to many of us today, either living out in the suburbs or maybe even some people living in cities that may not have a lot of density or a lot of walkability, is that there feel far less of these public spaces. But for a lot of cities, especially big cities, throughout history, you know, you needed a lot of these public spaces, and essentially people needed places to gather. And any place people did gather would become a community space. It's sort of simple as that.
These rest houses were equipped with basic amenities, from dormitory beds to communal...
You know, once again, the idea that people can only go a certain distance. Most people are walking, even if they're traveling longer distances on, you know, a donkey or a horse or whatever. There's only so far you can go, so you need frequent spaces for people to meet up, gather, socialize, eat, etc., etc., etc.
Dining and bathing facilities. The buildings also had central courtyards where travelers could socialize. The Chinese monk Fa Hien described these rest houses as well-maintained and observed that they were usually funded by the state or private patrons. Transportation. In ancient India, roadways were not mere dirt paths, but were paved with stones or gravel and were designed to endure heavy traffic and harsh weather conditions.
I mean, infrastructure is perhaps the biggest sign of a powerful state. If you're able to establish wide-ranging and durable infrastructure, you have got a powerful, influential government, state, empire on your hands, right? This is one of the most enduring accomplishments of the Roman Empire, was all the infrastructure, the roads, the aqueducts it managed to build. It's one of the greatest signs of the power of the Roman Empire. And so infrastructure, yeah, that's a good sign you've got a strong state.
Major streets were wide and well maintained, and according to Megasthenes, there were many chariots and carts using the throughway, indicating that they were suitable for various types of vehicles. We've built Compasport into a prosperous Indian megacity that also makes it a target for greedy conquerors.
Ooh.
So let's implement defensive measures. First, the fortifications. These would include massive walls, moats, and fortified gates. Generally speaking, fortifications incorporated thick, high walls made from either stone or brick. These walls were reinforced with bastions, which provided vantage points for archers to dispense with approaching armies. Multiple layers of defense were emphasized, so there were both outer and inner walls. Gates were heavily fortified, with doors made of iron or reinforced wood, and adorned with spikes to prevent elephants from battering them down. The entryways were designed to be narrow so that only a few people could pass through at any time. This made it easier for defenders to repel invaders. Some gates were even built with trap mechanisms, such as spike pits and concealed archers, to neutralize attackers who managed to breach the outer defenses. Fun fact, hidden passages and tunnels were also built to allow counterattacks or an escape if the situation were to become too dire.
Yep.
Within the city walls, military garrisons and watchtowers played a crucial role in maintaining security. Garrison troops were stationed at strategic points throughout the city, and watchtowers provided high vantage points for monitoring threats on the city's streets and in areas beyond the city walls. Policing and emergency services.
Ooh.
In ancient Indian cities, government law enforcement officers were responsible for maintaining order. They were tasked with patrol.
This is an interesting one because there have been a variety of different ways of enforcing the law throughout history. You know, right now many of us have an idea of sort of a modern police force as the enforcers of the law, but that sort of thing is quite uncommon. You know, oftentimes, if there was anyone to enforce the law, it would often be the military or someone associated with the military, and so oftentimes the law would not be enforced very closely, or the law would be enforced through bounties put on criminals, and it would be up to sort of, you know, private individuals to come and drag those people in, get their payout from the government or the local authority, but you still wouldn't necessarily have a police force, a sort of well-organized, established, funded police force that has been pretty uncommon throughout history. Not to say it's never happened. I mean, it's happening right now, but even before now, occasionally, but oftentimes there were perhaps more hands-off way of handling law enforcement.
Urban areas, investigating crimes, and ensuring public safety. And to better execute their duties, they often worked alongside local guilds and community leaders. Now, to ensure that Compasport doesn't burn down, we need firefighters, especially since many of our structures are built with flammable materials like wood. Texts like the Arthashastra mention the presence of fire brigades equipped with water buckets, wet blankets, and sand, and public wells were strategically placed for immediate access during a fire.
Fire brigades, these are things that you do see throughout history. Sometimes a public service, sometimes not. Oftentimes sort of a private service that people would be coughing up money for. So you do see them, though not, well, it's hard to say often or not. You see them throughout history. Oftentimes you'll find populated places that don't have any sort of organized firefighting force. Sometimes you will find them. And like I said, sometimes they will be state-funded. Often they'll be backed by some sort of private money, maybe a local guild, you know, the nobility, something like that.
And public wells were strategically placed for immediate access during a fire. So there you go, an ancient Indian city built from scratch.
All right.
And now you know.
Now I know. Wow. That was a good video. It was a really interesting video. You know, like I said, I appreciate the method they went for. You know, there's a couple ways you could have done this. You could have dug into one ancient city in particular, but I understand their goal was a lot more broad, right? You know, they had the broad goal of sort of showing you what a lot of ancient Indian cities looked like over a long period of time, so they decided to generalize, which I think is a good move. You know, for a sort of introductory explainer, that makes sense. It does make me curious more about some of the specifics that we didn't necessarily get to, but I really enjoyed this video. I will say, their goal to show you what an ancient Indian city actually looked like, I think they achieved that. I mean, I came in with very little idea. I could have made some assumptions based on how every city is, but very little idea. And I feel like I left with a pretty good sort of visual of, what ancient Indian cities were like. So I enjoyed this video. I feel like I definitely want to check out more of Odd Compass's content. The editing on this one was very high tier. Some good stuff. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one too. If you did, I'd appreciate a like. Subscribe to the channel. Check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all that, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.